Hello, everyone. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Room for Discussion. Let's start with the question. What do Oprah, Sting, Joe Rogan, and Steve Colbert have in common?
I think I have an idea. Our next guest, maybe?
That's exactly right. Each of them has sat down with him to talk about psychedelics, a topic he has almost single-handedly mainstreamed. Times named him one of the most influential people in the world, and it's easy to see why.
He's pretty good at changing minds and makes a solid case for protecting the right to think. In his new book, A World Appears, he turns to one of the deepest questions in science and philosophy, asking what is consciousness and how might we study it?
He's a best-selling author, Knight Professor at UC Berkeley, and lecturer at Harvard. My name is Helen.
I'm Mina.
And please join us in welcoming the one and only Michael Pollan.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Where should I sit?
Thank you. Grab a seat here.
Okay. Thank you all for coming. Very nice to be here.
And thank you, Michael Pollan, for joining us here in Amsterdam. We want to start off with this idea of set and setting that you speak about a lot, turning to our setting, which is we're sitting in Amsterdam, a city characterized for having quite a liberal attitude towards philosophy, religion, and drugs. And our question is this the type of audience that you write your books for?
Well, I know this about Amsterdam. The first time I came to Amsterdam, I was covering the Cannabis Cup for American Magazine. So I was exploring the world of cannabis for a book called Botany and Desire. I don't know how to answer that question. I think Amsterdam has such a history of free thinking that I'm not surprised that my books get published here and read here. And so it's been a meaningful place for me. I've come here for each of the last 5 books or so, and always enjoy it.
And one of your books as well on psychedelics, it feels like you've talked to almost anyone and everyone about psychedelics, but this wasn't always the case. You only tried LSD for the first time on the eve of your 60th birthday.
Mm-hmm.
We're curious.
I was a little late to the party.
Why so late?
Well, it's funny. I just happened to be in college, and at a college, Bennington College, where there were no drugs. There was like a lot of drinking. There were exactly 2 potheads on campus. It was just strange. And there had been a lot of psychedelics before I got there, and there were a lot of psychedelics after, apparently, but I just kind of missed it. It wasn't happening. But I had a lot of fear, I think, about using psychedelics. And when I finally did, so I had a series of research trips for how to change your mind. And before every one, I was incredibly nervous, because you never know what's going to happen. Set and setting, mostly dictate what happens. Set is your mindset, and the setting is the physical setting. And I just wanted to get that just right before I tried it. I ended up having a series of really illuminating, stimulating experiences. Not all easy, but it gave me a lot, including this new book, which was really inspired by psychedelic experiences I'd had, in 2 senses. The first sense is, and this is common to many people who have tried psychedelics, suddenly you're aware of consciousness in a way you're not day to day. And the metaphor I use in the book is that psychedelics, and meditation can do this too, smudges the windshield through which we're seeing reality. Normally, it's perfectly transparent, and we can just think, well, there's the world. The world appears. But after using psychedelics, you have this sense of like, well, what is this phenomenon between me and the world? And how can it be changed? And suddenly you're like, it sort of defamiliarizes consciousness in the way art can defamiliarize things that are very familiar. So that was one way. And the other way was I had this experience in my garden, and this was during a psilocybin experience, where the plants in my garden, and I'm a passionate gardener, I really love to garden, the plants became very conscious. I had a distinct sense that they were returning my gaze. They were just more alive than they'd ever been. And I sort of didn't know what to do with this insight. You know, my first impulse is to dismiss it as like, well, that's the psilocybin talking. But William James, who I read and had a big influence on me, the American psychologist, philosopher, he wrote a wonderful book about mystical experience. That's a chapter in Varieties of Religious Experience. And he talked to lots of people who'd had these amazing mystical experiences. They might be encounters with the divine or this sense of merging with nature, but really extraordinary experiences, and many of which underlie many religions. And he said, we can't dismiss these because we don't know enough. These are metaphysical questions. But the proper test is, is this belief useful? He was a pragmatist. Mm-hmm. And if you treat it as a hypothesis, then maybe you can try to evaluate it by bringing some other ways of knowing to bear on it. So I treated this idea of plants being conscious for this book as a hypothesis and explored it with a bunch of botanists. And lo and behold, plants are a lot more conscious than I thought.
We're going to go into your book a little later, but let's circle back, because you mentioned you were scared of taking psychedelics. Where did that fear come from?
Scary things can happen. It's not automatically a positive or pleasant experience, and you don't know what's going to happen, what is going to come up. And people take psychedelics and they get in touch with childhood trauma that they didn't know they had. I've met people who've had these shocking experiences of recovering memories that are truly traumatic. I was kind of an anxious kid, so I had, fears about that. Plus, there was a lot of misinformation and myth surrounding psychedelics, And we had drug education when I was a kid, before college. And you would hear stories about people taking LSD and jumping off of buildings and, falling to their death, which actually has happened. It's pretty rare. But, terrible accidents, people making huge mistakes. So all that baggage, which was part of the reaction against psychedelics in the 60s, definitely colored my thinking. And one of my surprises when I started exploring psychedelics, and the context in which I did in How to Change Your Mind, is the therapeutic context. There's been a lot of research in the U.S. As to whether psilocybin especially, but it could be LSD or MDMA, can be very helpful in treating mental illness. And there's a lot of evidence that it can. So that's what I was writing about. But I was surprised when I went back in and looked at the subject more carefully, that the classical psychedelics like psilocybin are remarkably safe in the sense of not being toxic. There's no lethal dose, and you can't say that about many drugs. They're also not addictive, but bad things can happen. These are accidents. But compared to a lot of the drugs we take routinely, things like Tylenol, for example, or acetaminophen, they're toxic at like 17 pills can kill you.
And you mentioned the 60s, and of course, what we think of first is Nixon's war on drugs, right?
Yeah.
And maybe it's safe to say it was largely unsuccessful, but it did really succeed at stigmatizing these substances until this day. Do you think there's anything valuable that comes out of this fear?
Well, I think caution is a good idea. These are powerful substances that have to be used with great care. I'm a great believer in using them with a guide or someone who is, staying closer to ground level. I think that's really important. And not only that, it makes for a better experience. I think when you have a guide, someone who is experienced and even trained in administering these drugs, that it frees you. You don't have to worry about someone knocking on the door or anything. They're like taking care of physical reality, and your mind can travel much more freely. So I think they have to be used with care. I don't think they're meant to be casual. I think they're too. I mean, if you look at other cultures that use them, it's always in a ceremony. There's always a leader of some kind, a shaman or and it's just approached with a sense of momentousness. And I think in the 60s, one of the mistakes we made was not understanding how to use them. You know, LSD arrived without an instruction manual, right? Yep. And we were too arrogant to think of, well, we should look at how traditional cultures use psychedelics, which is very carefully with this ritualized, and they have a container, a cultural container for it. And we just, you know, we were doing really stupid things. We were putting LSD in the punch bowl and drugging people without their permission.
I think one of the anecdotes at the time, actually, from Timothy Leary was to draw on Hermann Hesse as a kind of guidebook or a trip guide, essentially. And he looked at those, you know, literary novels as references for how to go about
and also the Tibetan Book of the Dead. I mean, people were looking for models, but the prestige of indigenous cultures wasn't what it is now, and people don't appear to have looked there. And
part of the kind of looking for models is also responding to the context of the time. In the 60s, you know, you had, and then 70s, you had this kind of anti-war movements. And when we look at some of the biggest threats that you've said face society today, they're one, the environmental crisis, but also political tribalism. And you've again linked psychedelics as useful here. Why is that connection so likely for you?
Well, in the 60s, you know, President Nixon said the biggest threats, his biggest enemies were the hippies and the blacks. Mm-hmm. And he went after them by criminalizing drugs. The drug war was not a public health measure. It was a political measure. And he said that, I mean, to people who, you know, we learned later. He confessed that that's what he was really up to. By making drugs illegal, you could disrupt both communities. It meant you could go in to the African-American community or Haight-Ashbury, and you were going to find drugs, and you could arrest whoever you wanted. And it did. It was very disruptive. I think the reason he was so threatened by LSD is because he believed it was making young American boys refuse to fight in the war. Mm-hmm. That was an unprecedented experience. I mean, for most of history, you send an 18-year-old off to war and they go and they obey. And suddenly you had a generation that was saying, no, we're not going to go. And he believed that LSD was kind of fueling this sort of critical thinking, and that it certainly can be an antidote to conformity. And so he may have been right. There may have been something like that true. I think that these drugs, it's hard to generalize, but I think you could make a case that psychedelics can foster independent thinking like that. There are also people who think it has implications for environmental thinking. There have been some studies, they're small and preliminary, that suggest that nature connectedness, which is a scale that psychologists use, you know, they have a scale for everything, that a single experience on psilocybin increases your nature connectedness. In other words, you feel more a part of nature and less alienated from it. I certainly had that experience. I mean, you know, I mentioned this experience of feeling that all the plants were alive. And people who take psychedelics are more open to animism, to this idea that everything is conscious, everything is alive. That's a very common experience. Theoretically, that should have environmental implications, right? Because whatever is conscious, you owe some moral consideration to, and therefore should treat more respectfully than we do. Whether that actually happens or not is another question.
And then that opens up this other aspect as well of open-mindedness, essentially. You've cited this one Guardian profile of the physicist Carlo Rovelli, who credits LSD as opening up his mind to some of the concepts of modern physics.
Quantum physics, yeah.
And there's also another anecdote, which is that all of these computer engineers and aerospace engineers also in the 60s were taking psychedelics. So what do you make also of the creative aspect or the creative potential of psychedelics?
I think, again, this is a hypothesis. I mean, we do have anecdotal stories about discoveries made on psychedelics. Another one is Kary Mullis, who invented PCR, which is the technique that biologists use to duplicate DNA. It's foundational to modern biology. He had the idea for that. It was a visual thing, too, while tripping on LSD. And he's wrote about it. He's no longer alive. There was some very preliminary work done to study creativity in psychedelics in the 70s. It really needs to be redone. I think it does encourage divergent thinking. I mean, the kind of thinking that leads to ideas, mind wandering and daydreaming and all these kind of what's called spontaneous thought, which is something I talk about in the new book. There was a test done in the 70s where James Fadiman, who was a researcher at Stanford, got together a group, early 70s, a group of creatives. There was like writers, architects, I think some scientists, and he gave them all 100 micrograms of LSD and, just let them trip for a little while. And then he said, go to your desks. And they were all people who had some block in their work. They were stuck. An architect could not solve a problem of circulation in a mall he was designing. And writers had writer's block. And they all reported that they broke through, or most of them reported that they had broken through. It's a really sloppy piece of research. There was no placebo.
Yeah, I was going to ask, what's missing for you from the studies
Yeah,
today?
well, it's self-reporting. There's no objective analysis that the solutions were any good. It's hard to study creativity. We have some measures of divergent thinking and things like that, but I think that there's potential. I think it's one of the things we need to study, and see if this is actually true. I have, in a way, you could say, for me, some of these experiences inspired a whole book. So I would have to say yes. I wrote a long thing about plant intelligence or plant consciousness that was inspired by an insight I had on psychedelics. There's a scientist I interview in this book named Christoph Koch. He's a German-American, very prominent consciousness researcher. He was there at the beginning with Francis Crick, who really launched the modern science of consciousness. And some people say Crick, who discovered the double helix, DNA, that he did that on LSD, but it's actually not true. That's a myth. He did use LSD, but not, I think, only after he discovered the double helix. But anyway, Crick was a scientific materialist. He believed that brains generate consciousness somehow, and he worked for years with Crick to figure out what are called the neural correlates of consciousness, what parts of the brain are involved in giving us subjective experience, which remains a complete mystery. He goes down to Brazil and has 5 sessions on the beach with ayahuasca, with a shaman, and he has an experience. Now remember, this is a brain guy, right? He ran the Allen Brain Institute in Seattle. He has this experience that consciousness is outside of his brain. He sounds just like Aldous Huxley in Doors of Perception, which is the best book on psychedelics you can read, who believed that the brain is involved in consciousness, but not by creating it, by channeling it. So we should think of our brains as like radio receivers or television sets that actually receive consciousness from some giant ocean of consciousness that's all over. And that we receive normally a very, what he called a measly trickle of consciousness, just what we need to survive. And what psychedelics do is open the valve, the reducing valve, so that more rushes in. And that's that experience people have of like being extra conscious, super conscious, much more sensory information, fresh insight. And it's a very attractive theory. I mean, it's a variety of idealism. How do you prove it? No idea.
Somewhere where there has been maybe a little more success with these studies is, of course, the clinically significant reductions in, say, depression or anxiety among cancer patients. Can you explain why psychedelics are so well suited to these kind of mental conditions?
I don't think we know for sure, but there has been a lot of really promising research that I wrote about in How to Change Your Mind, showing that, and the first thing I looked at was terminal cancer patients who were paralyzed with anxiety and fear about their death would be given psilocybin in a guided situation, university setting, and a remarkable number of them, and I interviewed many of them, completely lost their fear of death. It totally reset their thinking. The same drug has been used to cure addictions, cocaine, cigarettes, alcohol, and has had great success, much better than the standard treatments. They've also been used
What exactly about psychedelics makes it so different from these standard treatments in curing addiction, for example?
I think it actually, my best guess, there are a couple theories about this, but that psychedelics makes the brain more plastic. It returns it to a place where it can learn new patterns. And addiction, depression, anxiety, OCD, these are all products of a brain that is stuck in loops of rumination and can't get out. And we're all familiar with this, but these are extreme forms. And one way to think about it, and there was a very good metaphor from a psychedelic researcher at Imperial College London, who said, think of the mind as a hill. He was Dutch, actually, so he didn't say mountain. And that your thoughts are grooves worn down. Every time a sled goes down, it creates grooves. But over time, those grooves get really deep, and it's impossible to take your sled down the hill without falling into one of those grooves. What psychedelics do in his version is it's like a fresh snowfall, and it fills all the grooves and allows you to take a new path down the hill. So I think that's a beautiful idea. A more scientific way to put it is that there are critical periods for learning for humans and for animals too. So that, we all know how if you're 2 or 3 or 4, you can learn new languages really quickly. You're just a sponge. In your early adolescence is a critical period for social learning. You learn how to read other people, and nothing matters more than your social life and your new friends. And there's a critical period after a stroke where within the first few weeks, if you get intensive physical therapy, you can do a lot of recovery. All these critical periods close at a certain point, perhaps because the brain needs resources for other things. We don't know. Anyway, a researcher in the US who now works at Berkeley with me, named Gul Dolan, she has shown that psychedelics reopen critical periods of learning, so that they create a window in which you can learn a new pattern. And so if you're stuck in a narrative, like if you're depressed and your narrative is I'm worthless, I'm unworthy of love, you can learn a new pattern with the help of the guide who suggests, well, maybe you are worthy of love.
And is this at any point that you take psychedelics?
Yes. Although, it stays, this critical period, so she's mostly done this work in mice and rats and octopuses, oddly enough, because octopuses have a critical period for social learning, and then they want to be alone completely. They're very solitary. And she gives them, in that case, MDMA, and then she gives them a choice of chambers to go into, and one, they can hang out with other octopuses, and the other, they can be by themselves. And after the MDMA, and I don't just mean at the initial period right after you take it, but for like 2 weeks after, they want to hang out with other octopuses. So they're back to that social period. it's a wild experiment. There was reasons she used octopuses. I don't remember what they were. And they were very little ones. So the idea is you can learn new patterns. We all get stuck in certain patterns, and psychedelics makes the mind more plastic for a period of time. And she's found this, by the way, on all psychedelics. And the longer the trip, the longer the critical period remains open. So ibogaine, which is an African psychedelic made from a root of a iboga tree, has a really long trip, like 36 hours. And the critical period stays open the longest. So that's one mechanistic theory that might explain it.
If psychedelics become a major medical treatment, the next question that naturally follows is who's going to own them? And we did some research, and in the US alone, there are more than 1,000 psychedelic-related patterns. So are we heading towards a system of controlled access?
Well, I think that so definitely pharmaceutical companies and startups see psychedelics as the next wave in mental health treatment. We'll see if that's true. There's some reason to think it might be. So of course there's a gold rush, and companies want to control them. Will they succeed? It's sort of like the cat's out of the bag. Like, you can't really own psilocybin. It's very easy to grow it. There's still an underground. And so they're trying to patent, improved versions of psilocybin, synthetic versions. I don't know whether that'll work. I think it may be difficult to control. There are also a lot of problems with the business model, like how do you make money in psychedelic therapy, or will insurance cover psychedelic therapy? Because even though you only need a couple pills, you need a lot of support in the way it's given. You need two people with you the whole time. They have to prepare you, which takes hours. Then they have to help you integrate what happened. That's what you do after the experience. And that is expensive. It's hours and hours of therapeutic time. So it isn't. I would not invest in it. If I was thinking about it that way. But this effort to patent psychedelics, they're also trying to there are a lot of companies trying to take the trip out of psychedelics.
Yeah. And
they think that it's happening at the cellular level. It's not about the experience. Most of the scientists I talk to are pretty convinced it is about the experience you have. It's not about some chemical change going on in your cells. But everybody's trying to fit it into the model of mental health treatment now, which is you take an SSRI every day the rest of your life. Mm-hmm. They want a pill that you can go to work and drive a car, and so they're trying to create LSD without any side effects, is how they refer to the hallucinations and other interesting phenomena.
I mean, you've done a lot to mainstream psychedelics, something that's come to known as the Pollan effect. And part of that mainstreaming is the legalization of psychotherapeutic guided sessions, something that you strongly advocate for. And here in the Netherlands, these kind of sessions are going to set you back around 1,000 euros a day. Is this the kind of vision that you had when you advocated for the legal use of psychedelics?
No, I mean, to the extent I had a vision, it was that this would be therapy covered by health insurance. And it may yet be. I mean, if it proves effective, and I think MDMA for trauma has a lot. There's a lot of evidence it's more effective than whatever other treatments we're using. That that's the only way to ensure access. It is expensive, but if it works better than the current treatments, then health insurance should pay for it, and that's how it'll be available. But there is an underground, and that too is still expensive, and not everybody can afford it. But there are going to be different ways to get access, I think.
I think this leads us to a broader question of why necessarily advocate for the medical route, and why not commit to, say, either decriminalization or legalization recreationally, given that the effects...
Well, I do support decriminalization. I don't think anyone should go to jail for using drugs. I mean, I just don't think that helps anybody and is very damaging to people and to society. The value of the medical route is, it's important this research get done, that we really find out using rigorous, double-blind, placebo-controlled trials, that our intuition that this is a very helpful treatment for depression or anxiety really works. And the reason I think to support the medical, when you say medicalization, it sounds like it's colonialism and you're going to take over all of psychedelics, but you're not. You can't control what's already happening. So I think if you go down this medically approved route, at the same time you decriminalize. And we've done that, in 3 states in the U.S. You can have guided psilocybin experiences in Oregon, New Mexico, and Colorado, and more are coming. So we're gradually moving in that direction. There's still regulation, and I'm not sure I'm against that, though, because I really do think cannabis is not the model for psychedelics. I think they're much more momentous, serious. People can get in psychological trouble. I mean, they can on cannabis, too, we're finding. But I think that the lesson from all other cultures is you need a cultural container for these drugs at high doses to be used safely. Microdosing, I don't think is an issue. I don't think is a problem. I don't know that it works, but many people find a lot of benefit in microdosing. This is using a sub-perceptual dose of a psychedelic every couple days.
Yeah, I mean, there's been studies also on even the placebo effect, and they've compared the placebo effect of not taking any psychedelic, but being told that you're taking psychedelic.
Yeah, and it helped.
Microdosing also being similar.
Right, and that may be what's going on with microdosing. I mean, if I give you a sugar pill and say this is going to make you feel better, 20 or 30 or 40% of people will feel better. If I give you, instead of a sugar pill, a tiny little dose of LSD, you're going to feel much better because we project so much power onto that molecule. So yes, I think there may be a powerful placebo effect going on when you're microdosing psychedelics. And great, let's not ruin that.
In preparation for this interview, we also talked to a psychedelic guide, so someone who sits with you during these sessions. And they told us as psychedelics have become so mainstream, there's a whole completely new part introduced to their job, managing expectations.
Interesting, yes.
And because, of course, that's very counterproductive to the process itself. Is that just something that we have to accept as the cost of mainstreaming?
Probably. I don't know how you avoid that. In How to Change Your Mind, and in this new book, I described the most powerful psychedelic experience I'd have, which is one of total ego dissolution. My sense of self exploded in a cloud of blue Post-it notes, and then fluttered to the ground, and became this pool of blue paint. And then what happens when you lose your sense of self? There's no border, there's no membrane, and so you merge with something larger than yourself. James called it unitive consciousness, and it's central to mystical experience. And for me, I merged with this beautiful piece of music that the guide was playing at the time. But some people merge with a divinity or nature or whatever. And ever since, believe me, people come tell me about their trips all the time. People would say, but I haven't had that ego dissolution, and they're,
So they're still expecting it as well.
Yeah, and that it becomes the goal, and there's great disappointment if you don't have it. And you don't always have it. I only had it that one time.
On that note, thank you so much. I think it's now time to turn to our audience. I'm sure there's some questions out there.
There's one.
The guy in the blue sweater, please. We're going to come with the microphone.
You hold it. Okay. Hi.
Hi.
I haven't read your new book because it only just came out, so it's not about that. I'm sorry. I'm really curious about, you mentioned guides. You have somebody that sits with you. And you also talked about the prestige of indigenous communities. And I wonder how in modern Western civilization you see this cross-fertilization of ideas and what is the ideal there. I noticed that in sessions that I've attended, I can get really frustrated when I see too much indigenous appropriation. So I don't connect to those cultures. Like I appreciate them for what they are, but I don't need indigenous language songs in my ceremonies. I don't understand what people are saying. And I don't have a better alternative, but I don't want to be seen as a villager that's gonna come together in a little tiki hut or something, you know?
Yeah. So, I mean, cultural appropriation is an issue, definitely, but I think the kinds of things I'm talking about that we could have and may still, or starting to learn from other cultures, is the deeper kind of structure of what they're doing. It's not the specifics of what's on the altar, or that there is an altar, or that there's Icaros playing, you know, indigenous music. It's more this idea of the attitude with which they approach it, which is to say, with a certain solemnity, recognition of that it's momentous for this person, that there is some kind of ritual. It needn't be the ritual of that culture. It can be a ritual of our culture. We have rituals too, and that there is this recognition that also that you need an elder of some kind to help guide you, and or that it's a good idea to have one. So it's those kind of things that are kind of the deep structure of indigenous use. And of course, it's different from one culture to another. Some are, you know, group sessions. The Native American approach is very foreign to us, but I still think there are things we can learn from it that are way short of appropriation. Thank you. Follow up?
So can I follow up on that?
Yeah.
Do you think there's not room for maybe a hierarchy-less way to do psychedelics?
Yeah, there probably is. I mean, there probably is. I think that I can imagine that. But I think, I mean, the other way to think about it is, let's create our own cultural container, right? That's appropriate to who we are and where we are. But some kind of container is a good idea. So people are using psychedelics in a group context. It's certainly one way to make treatment more economical. And, you know, many other cultures have used them in a group context. But so I think of it as a cultural project. What would be a really healthy container for these that is suitable to Dutch culture or American culture or just Western culture? You know, I don't care what the rituals are, but a certain amount of ritual, I think, attending the ceremony and calling it a ceremony. And right there, you know, that's changing it. But let's invent a new container.
Do you have another question? Yeah?
So you've spoken throughout your career to people from so many different paradigms, from indeed scientists to indigenous practitioners, philosophers. Has that changed the way you view like epistemology, what constitutes valid knowledge?
Yeah, that's a great question. I've been really fortunate as a journalist that I get to talk to people who have many different ways of knowing things. And in this new book, for example, I talked to a lot of scientists of consciousness, but I realized at a certain point that novelists know an awful lot about consciousness, and poets too, and Buddhists. And so I'm very careful not to put scientific knowledge on a special pedestal, which we tend to do in our society. It has the most authority for most people. But throughout my career, I found that there are many times when culture gets there before science does. A trivial example I remember from when I was writing about, I've written several books on food and nutrition, which is an area where sometimes culture is way ahead of the scientists who struggle with nutrition. And the study came out a couple years ago, and it got a lot of attention, at least in the US, saying that lycopene, this very important polyphenol or antioxidant in tomatoes, your body can't use it unless you eat the tomatoes with some form of fat. So putting olive oil on tomatoes turns out to be like a brilliant invention. Mm-hmm. And, you know, the Italian grandmas figured that out a couple hundred years ago. So there's a lot of wisdom in culture too. So, and, you know, indigenous people, we often talk, we see their way of knowing as mythological, not epistemological. And I think that that's wrong. I think there is a lot of knowledge there, and we have trouble translating it. I talk about this in the book, actually, that in traditional cultures, ayahuasqueros, the people who figured out how to make ayahuasca, which is not at all intuitive. You have to combine these two plants, like out of 1 million plants in the jungle. Like, who figured that out and how? They'll tell you the plants told them that they had visions, and we tend to dismiss that. But what if there's some sense in which that's true? So all my work, I think you'll find, I'm referred to as a science writer, and there are reasons for that. I used the word botany in a book title once. And I was professor of science journalism, it's true. But I think the most interesting writing is when you layer multiple perspectives. And, when I look at plants, there's the botanical view, there's the historical view, the social view, the psychological view. There's just so many. And then there's the personal view, the phenomenological view, my own lived experience. And things get interesting when you multiply those lenses. So thanks for your question.
We're going to move on now to your new book, but I just wanted to quickly mention to anyone still curious, there will be a book signing after, so if you have questions, you can go up to Michael Pollan, still ask any questions. But for now, looking at your new book, A World Appears, it moves on from psychedelics to consciousness. And you also mentioned, incidentally, a lot of these consciousness scientists have indeed taken psychedelics.
Yeah, that was a striking thing. Maybe it's not surprising that people interested in the mind would be experimenting with psychedelics, but this kept coming up. I didn't think this book would be about psychedelics at all, except to inspire it. But it keeps popping up because of my interviews mostly with the scientists who were using it. I told you about Christoph Koch, but there were others too. Kalina Christoph Hadjilevia, this psychologist at University of British Columbia who studies spontaneous thought, which is this fascinating idea. It's mind wandering and daydreaming and intuition. She says, I said, how can you learn to have more spontaneous thought? Because she thinks it's really valuable, that spontaneous thought is a source of creativity. It is how we make meaning of our lives, yet she's concerned that we don't have enough of it because of, we're scrolling on social media when we used to be daydreaming and things like that, which is like, oh, I hadn't thought about that. Something's lost. A lot is lost, doom scrolling, but in particular this. And she said psilocybin is a very good way to nurture spontaneous thought. And I was surprised over and over again that it kept coming up. Now, there's a little bit of selection bias because these scientists know they can talk to me about their psychedelic experiences. But anyway.
It fits in with this idea, as you say, also that cultures are ahead of scientists and here humanities are ahead of scientists. Yeah,
that was a surprise to me, So I'm talking to all these scientists and they're telling me about they're trying to understand lived experience, why we have a subjective point of view on the world. What is that about? Why do we have a voice in our head? Why do we have this interior space where we can talk to ourselves? And they're working really on how does a visual perception enter your awareness? And that's fine, and it's, I think, more tractable. I think it's easier to do science on that because we know more about the visual system than anything else. But our experience is so much more about thoughts. It's the stream of consciousness. It's like, why does one thought lead to another? And for understanding the contents of consciousness, I found novelists were just the most knowledgeable. And I learned a lot, both reading fiction and interviewing. I interview a stream of consciousness writer, an English writer named Lucy Ellman. And she's written this fantastic book. It's called Ducks Newburyport. I have no idea why. And it's 1,000 pages and it's a single sentence. which sounds like something, I'm not going to read that, but it's actually very readable and funny and totally enjoyable. And it puts you inside the head of this middle-class, middle-aged woman who lives in Ohio and has a home pie baking business for 1,000 pages. And it just captures the rhythm of thought and the strange byways and juxtapositions. And I learned more about the mind from that novel and talking to Lucy than I did from a lot of the scientists. So, yeah, I think we have to be open about where we get our knowledge.
I mean, you talk a lot about other scientists, but don't be so humble yourself, because in your book you also did a very interesting self-run experiment by psychologist Colbert.
Yeah.
Can you give us a brief insight on how you conducted it and what you learned from it?
Sure. So in this section about thought, or the contents of consciousness, I heard about this scientist named Russell Hurlburt at the University of Las Vegas, who's been doing a single experiment for his entire 50-year career, and that is what he calls sampling inner experience. So you wear a beeper that he designed, because in 1973 there were no portable electronic devices, believe it or not. And you have this little earpiece, and at arbitrary times of the day, it sends this very sharp beep into your ear. Beep! And you know exactly what it is. You're not thinking, is that my phone? Is that someone else's phone? And then you write down what you were thinking at that moment. And then later in the day, you collect about 5 beeps every day. You can't wear it all day. It drives you crazy. It makes you very self-conscious. You're constantly thinking, what if it goes off now?
So you're anticipating also.
Yes, so that's a problem with it. But there are other problems too. It's very hard to figure out what you're thinking when you really scrutinize it. So you have this session with him at the end of the day. You get on Zoom with him and he interrogates you. And so for example, I have to warn you, my beeps were not that profound, and they were mostly about food. I was seasoning a fillet of salmon, and I was walking, so I put the salt on it, and I'm walking to the fridge, and the beep goes off just as I'm thinking, shit, I forgot the pepper. So I have to take it back and put on the pepper. So the thought was very clear. I thought this was an easy one, pepper. And he says, well, did you say the word pepper, or did you hear the word pepper? And when you hear that voice in your head, ask yourself, are you speaking or are you listening? It's very hard to say. And so anyway, it was challenging. The big finding after 50 years is that we think in very different styles, and that I think a lot of people assume that consciousness is in language, is a verbal phenomenon. But that's a small minority. Not a small, but it's a minority. It's like a quarter or a third. A lot of people think in images, much more than in words. And then there are people who think in what he calls unsymbolized thought, which is neither words or images, but just kind of abstractions. And then there's a fourth group of people who have very little inner experience. And Hurlburt decided that was me. Thank you for laughing.
Yeah, I think he said your interior was sparsely furnished.
Yes, my interior was sparsely furnished. And this was, we had a lot of arguments. I could not separate out a thought from what was going on simultaneously. So I'm waiting online at the bakery, deciding whether to buy a roll to make a sandwich for lunch, another profound thought I had. And but I couldn't separate out. I did have an image of that roll, kind of an emoji of a roll in my head. But I also was acutely aware of the smells in the room. There was a bakery, the voices of the people in line behind me, this unflattering plaid skirt that this woman had in front of me. All this was part of that moment, and I couldn't separate out. He just wanted to know one thought. And I don't think there ever is one thought. I think thoughts are colored by the previous thought and the next thought, and and no thought occurs the same way twice either. It's incredibly nuanced phenomenon that I think novelists capture better than scientists. So he concluded from the fact that I couldn't separate out this thought that I was kind of backfilling this yawning hole of emptiness with all this contextual information. So I got a little defensive when he said I didn't have an interior life.
I mean, outside of being anecdotal, what does this kind of experiments reveal about how reliable our introspection is?
Well, what it reveals is things are weirder in there than we thought, I think. And that, we use this word thinking. What are you thinking? And we assume that everybody knows what it means. But in fact, it means very different things to different people, that we have distinctly different ways of thinking. And that's useful to know. I think that's a significant finding.
And on the topic of these findings and thinking about thinking, you mentioned it earlier at the start of our interview. Are plants conscious?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I would not say plants are conscious. I would say they're sentient. Mm-hmm. And I'll try to draw that distinction, which I rely on in the book. Sentience is kind of the base form, the foundational form of consciousness. It's much simpler than the consciousness we have. It's basically you're aware of your environment and you can recognize whether changes in your environment are good or bad for you, and then act appropriately. This may be a property of all life. It's certainly a property of plants. I'll just give you some examples. So I went looking for research about plants that would show whether they were, are they intelligent or conscious? And intelligence and consciousness are separate things. We all know people who are conscious and not intelligent. Here's some experiments that have recently been done. Plants can remember they can learn and remember for at least 28 days. You can teach a plant, a Mimosa pudica, the sensitive plant, which is this tropical plant that when you touch it, its leaves go limp to protect itself. If you shake one in a pot, it'll do that. But after you've done it like 5 times, it'll learn, I can ignore this stimulus, and it'll remember that for a whole month. A bean plant looking for something to climb up knows where the pole is somehow. And if you look at it in time lapse, and I posted some videos on my website, it's not just arbitrarily spiraling up, it's casting itself at the pole. How does it know where the pole is? Can it see? There is some evidence that plants can see. We know they can see the sun, but they may be able to see other things. Or it's echolocation, and that every time the plant cell divides, it makes a little noise, and maybe it's bouncing that noise off the pole, and that's how it tells. A root, you can put a little fertilizer in a maize, and a pea or corn root will find the shortest path to that fertilizer, just like a mouse with a piece of cheese. That was pretty incredible. But one of the spookiest and most suggestive is that you can anesthetize plants with the same chemicals we use to anesthetize us for surgery. Now, you might think plants are already out, but they're not. They're just slow. And if you take a plant with an obvious behavior, like a Venus flytrap, and you put it in a bell jar and you give it an anesthetic gas, like xenon or something, it will not react for 5 hours, and then it'll regain, and the sensitive plant too. So you have to ask yourself, what is the plant losing when it loses awareness or ability to act?
But I think
we would say we're losing consciousness, but what are we saying about plants?
There, the question that also comes up is it also just our failure on the study of sentience versus consciousness and how we study it ourselves in finding out, how plants act? And I think part of that also comes up to what is most unsettling if plants are conscious.
Well, you're immediately wondering, can I eat them? And that's a concern. And you can eat them, it's fine. And I looked at this question of, do they feel pain? Mm-hmm. And I talked to one plant neurobiologist, that's what they call themselves, even though there are no neurons involved. And this guy said, yes, of course they feel pain, but hey, we have to eat them. What are we going to do? We eat other creatures that feel pain. And then I talked to another one plant, and he said, no, pain would not be adaptive for a creature that can't run away. They're aware they're being eaten by caterpillars or whatever, but they act appropriately. They send toxins into their leaves, or alert other plants, all of which they do. But he said they don't feel pain. But remember too, plants produce fruits and seeds that are meant to be picked up and eaten by mammals and birds. So they're fine with that. And grasses, which are really the basis of our diet, are regenerated by being eaten by ruminants. So don't worry.
Part of I think the anthropomorphizing also goes towards AI now, and this idea that machines can be conscious. The CEO of Anthropic recently kind of gave a very hesitant answer to, our AI might be conscious or might not be.
He said he thinks anymore. Claude is anxious.
Yeah, and
what does that even mean?
Good question. You ask him. I don't know. I think it was crazy. And, they've given Claude the right to end any conversation with a human that makes it uncomfortable. So the anthropomorphizing is going on at the highest levels in Silicon Valley. And, I think it's anthropomorphizing. I think these chatbots are doing some very spooky things. But you have to remember, they have read the whole literature on consciousness. They've read novels. They've read poetry. They know how to talk the talk. And they do. And the real test would be, if you want to see if an AI is conscious, build it from the ground up and exclude from the training set all discussion of consciousness, feeling, no novels, no poetry, and then see if it can talk to you about how it feels and its anxiety.
It might not even be able to speak to us if it's not trained on language itself.
Well, you can still train it on language, but you have to exclude certain things, which is hard to do if you're just letting it loose on the whole internet. Mm-hmm. So I make an argument in the book why AI, I don't think AIs, at least as computers are now built, could be conscious. And there are a lot of reasons, but the one I'll just leave you with is, we have this metaphor that the brain is a kind of computer. And it's an attractive metaphor in some ways, but metaphors, a computer scientist once said, the price of metaphor is eternal vigilance, because it can lead to very sloppy thinking and this equivalence that brains equal computers. But computers, have this very sharp distinction between hardware and software, right? You can run the same software on many different hardwares. And in a way, the software is immortal. But brains are not like that. Brains are, every experience you have, every memory you have is a physical change in your brain. And your brains are different than one another because you had raised on different life experiences, and this materially shapes your brain. So you can't extract consciousness like a software program and run it on something else. And that's the premise of of conscious AI, that consciousness is a kind of software or algorithm, and we can run it on silicon just as well once we have enough power. I don't think that's true.
And if you don't think that the real danger is that AI might become conscious, is the real danger then that we humans start treating it as such?
Yes, the real danger is, my argument, as tight as I think it is, may not matter a bit, because we will be convinced that they're conscious. We are already, people are falling in love with chatbots. They're, treating them as friends. They're having these relationships, but they're totally synthetic relationships. There's a sociologist I interviewed named Sherry Turkle who points out, and she's very wise, that technology can cause us to forget what we know about life. And when we have a conversation with a chatbot, and we call it a conversation, we're cheapening our definition of a conversation. We're giving up on eye contact, on facial expressions, on body language, on the kind of synchronization that happens between two people in conversation. It's sort of like accepting an emoji as a substitute for emotion. It's a very thin, pallid version. And I'm worried that we'll go down that path and gradually lose or atrophy the muscles that allow us to have human conversation. I think it's fateful. And I worry, too, that we'll grant personhood or rights to AIs, and we'll lose our ability to control them entirely when that happens.
I think these rights are on trial right now with Meta and YouTube.
That's right.
And they're in a landmark trial, essentially, arguing that Instagram is a drug of some type.
Yeah. It is addictive.
Do you think there is a case here for protecting our consciousness or our privacy?
Absolutely. I think our consciousness is under siege. I think, when we hear that social media is hacking our attention, what is attention if not a significant dimension of consciousness? It's how we direct our consciousness at this and not that. So these algorithms and these companies want to monetize your consciousness, and chatbots are just the next thing. Instead of hacking our attention, they're hacking our attachments, our ability to form emotional bonds. That's momentous, and I think we should defend against it. And I sort of came to this place in this book that, yes, the hard problem of consciousness is really interesting, and we haven't solved it yet, and it's important that we work on it. We may never be able to solve it. But meanwhile, we have the fact of consciousness, this marvelous gift we all have, this ability to talk to ourselves and think about whatever we want, and we're squandering it. And I think we have to take steps. I've been thinking a lot about consciousness hygiene, and getting off, putting down our phones, tolerating that moment of boredom when you're standing online. Because what happens when you're having that 90 seconds of boredom, waiting for the barista to make your drink? Well, it used to be you daydreamed or mind wandered, and who knows what could come out of that. Meanwhile, instead of, if you're scrolling on phones, you're not thinking your own thoughts. You're just letting someone else kind of dribble their thoughts through your brain.
And you once revealed that every book of yours within it contains the grain for the next one. So naturally, as we close this interview, we cannot help but wonder what comes next after consciousness.
I cannot help but wonder either. I don't know. I don't know where I'm going now. It's, a friend of mine said, "Oh, now you've done consciousness. What's left? Death?" I don't think I want to write a book on death.
Well,
we'll see. There'll be another book. I just don't know what it is.
Well, thank you so much, and thank you so much for joining us.
Yeah, thanks for your questions. Thanks a lot. Thank you, guys. Well done.
Thank you.
Well,
I'll be signing books over there at that table.
if you're still left curious, our next interview is on April 13th with Evan Osnoff, a journalist at The New Yorker, focusing on the US and China.
And right after that, we have the Turkish ambassador to the Netherlands, Her Excellency Miss Fatma Seren Yazgan. But for now, please join us in one last applause for Michael Pollan.